In 1958, I wrote the following: "There are no hard distinctions between what is real and what is unreal, nor between what is true and what is false. A thing is not necessarily either true or false. It can be both true and false." I believe that these assertions still make sense and do still apply to the exploration of reality through art. So, as a writer, I stand by them. But as a citizen, I cannot.
So, you just heard Harold Pinter giving his 2005 Nobel lecture for his prize in literature. I find his words extremely fascinating. To reiterate, when it comes to the exploration of reality through art, there is no distinction between what is true and false. However, when it comes to citizenry, there is a true and false. This is a video I've wanted to make for a long time, the myth of objective criticism in art, because it's a myth I've believed myself, and we'll get into that. This video will be in dialogue with a few of my others. But until I found Pinter's lecture, I didn't really know how to frame this video. Ironically, Pinter's initial statement has no singular objective truth either, because we don't know for certain what Pinter means by truth. But if I had to guess, I would imagine he means a definitive interpretation of a piece of art. Hence why there are multiple possible interpretations of any given piece of art. Each interpretation can stand up to different levels of scrutiny, and different interpretations may clash with authorial intent. But that does not necessarily make them outright false. I think a good example would be Mulan. One reading of the film would be that women can do anything men can do, especially when given the same resources and instruction to succeed. Another reading would be that Mulan is an allegory for the trans experience, particularly in her musical number, "When Will My Reflection Show Who I Am Inside?" It is only when Mulan experiences gender from a different lens that she finds herself. Both of these readings are valid. They both stand up to some level of scrutiny regardless of what the writers behind Mulan intended. And the reason both of these readings are valid is because of the power of subjectivity. A trans person who watches Mulan would probably experience the film from a different subjective lens than I would. Both myself and this trans person would bring different outlooks to the film when it came time to interpret, and that's okay. One reading might have more evidence behind it, but that's not to say that either interpretation is unvaluable. Both have value in their own way. We should avoid binaries or an idea of an absolute view of reality. Just to hammer this point home a little further, another good example of what I'm talking about is "My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun" by Emily Dickinson. When my teacher showed my class this poem for the first time, she presented us with 6 possible interpretations and basically had us weigh them against each other. This could potentially be a poem about man's relationship with God, a poem about slavery, a poem about the process of writing and creativity, a poem about masculinity, a poem about fighting in a war, a poem about sexuality and pleasure, and those are just 6 possibilities out of many. And the thing is, I don't think we can pin down any definitive reading. All of these are possible interpretations, though some might be more backed by textual evidence than others. I think the only thing we can perhaps say for sure is that this is a poem about power dynamics. There truly is no accounting for taste in art. A person's subjective life experience is going to have an effect on the way they criticize a piece of art and on the way they interpret a piece of art. It's kind of impossible to separate interpretation from criticism. For example, I recently did a video called "Bad Poems by Good Poets," and there were a lot of contentious opinions in the comments of that video. A lot of folks especially had a problem with "Taking Off Emily Dickinson's Clothes" by Billy Collins. While plenty of commenters agreed with the popular consensus that the poem is uncomfortable and chauvinist, several other commenters didn't feel that whatsoever. I also recently did a video on Skillshare's Instapoetry class, wherein I showed off a poem I wrote. Some commenters thought this poem was good and achieved exactly what I hoped it would, while others felt the poem had some problems in its chosen execution. In both of these cases, from my videos, interpretation was a big factor on the critical responses. And ultimately, that's great. I love that poetry can create these discussions. I think this is sort of what art is all about, no? The search for truth in the human experience. As Pinter says,
"So language in art remains a highly ambiguous transaction, a quicksand, a trampoline, a frozen pool, which might give way under you, the author, at any time. But as I have said, the search for the truth can never stop. It cannot be adjourned, it cannot be postponed. It has to be faced right there, on the spot.
And this, I think, is the problem with a lot of critics who claim to strive for objectivity. Yes, this is a video about objectivity in art, but it's also a critique of certain critics on this platform, people like Mahler and The Critical Drinker. I think the problem with a lot of objective critics is that they want to pinpoint a truth, but they aren't concerned with the search for truth. I don't think they view language in art as an ambiguous transaction, as an exchange between two parties. I think they view language in art as a one-way delivery. For many critics of The Critical Drinker's ilk, they expect art, particularly movies, to deliver entertainment. And if it fails to do that, it's a bad work, no discussion. But entertainment, too, is subjective, obviously. Unfortunately, these types of critics view art through such a narrow lens that they don't truly engage with it. They don't want to search for truth, they simply want truth delivered to them in their preferred way. Now, at this point in the video, you're probably saying something like, okay, but surely there are actual objective technical measures for art, right? And sure, for example, if a fiction writer uses improper punctuation, that's an objective technical error on their part. Or in the movie Lady Ballers, as Some More News' video on the movie points out, there's a moment at the very beginning of the film where we see a technical error in the use of eye lines. But the thing is, the rules change all the time. What might be considered objectively good artistry in one day and age can change in as few as 10 years. There's actually this comment from a Critical Drinker video that I think puts it quite well. Quote, "I say this as a longtime subscriber and fan, I think you're kind of wrong on the topic of themes. Before that, what I agree on. Themes aren't a get-out-of-making-a-good-film free card. Themes aren't a substitute for a good story. Themes aren't the same as narrative. What I disagree on, that film has an objective standard. I would rather say film has a collectively negotiated preference that is colloquially called good filmmaking. What makes one camera movement, distance, or lens type better than another? Nothing objectively, but rather the subjective effect the combination of composition, lighting, scale, and depth has as we traverse a story, or sometimes a non-story or an anthology. If it were objective, objections would more quickly be settled when discussing things like narrative or cinematography. I don't just mean in the YouTube sphere, I mean even among cinematographers and film historians." Unquote. I really want to emphasize that idea of a collectively negotiated preference. I think this is something that's true for pretty much all art forms, and again, it's something that changes decade after decade. Many films and books that were classics in their own time are all but forgotten today. What's more, artists can intentionally break the rules all the time. There are lots of movies that intentionally mess with eye lines. Does that make them bad? In The Critical Drinker's case, he believes that theme and interpretation really shouldn't matter when it comes to critique, except for when they should. I did a whole video on it, go check it out if you want, but to refresh your memory, he says,
"Talking endlessly about themes also allows you to neatly avoid engaging with actual criticism of the film, having to use your brain to explain away all the problems and inconsistencies, or even worse, facing up to the terrifying prospect that maybe it's just not as good as you've somehow convinced yourself it is. You don't have to worry about any of that, because your understanding of the movie transcends simple stuff like plot structure, internal consistency, and character development."
These are interesting technical aspects to bring up, because I would argue that plot structure, internal consistency, and character development are all somewhat subjective metrics as well, at least to some extent. For example, Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel is a book that structures its plot very unconventionally, and I love it for that. However, a lot of other people dislike this book for the way it delivers its narrative. Or in terms of character development, some people might look at a static character and think it's bad the character doesn't change. Others would say that's intentional and it works. It depends on the story, doesn't it? As for inconsistency, I think there are certain objective inconsistencies we can find in stories. For example, if we return to Mulan, we see that Mulan is initially dismissed from her service because she fails to measure up to the physical demands placed upon her. But if you'll recall, Mulan is only there so her father doesn't have to be. Her father, who has a physical impairment and surely also wouldn't measure up to the physical demands required of him. But does that inconsistency actually detract from the experience of the film? I would say no, and the majority of viewers would agree. However, inconsistencies get more subjective than that. For example, Luke's characterization in The Last Jedi. A lot of folks would argue that Luke's behavior in this movie is completely inconsistent with everything we know about him. Other folks would argue the opposite, however. Who is right in that scenario? Well, who could objectively say? Luke is supposed to be a living person with complex thoughts and emotions, no? How do we know for certain how he would behave in any set of circumstances? I often specialize in poetry on this channel, and I literally have a video about how flexible the medium of poetry is. Poets break the rules of language and writing all the time. Poets even break the rules of poetic form all the time. For example, Petrarchan sonnets are typically supposed to have a rhyme scheme and lines of iambic pentameter. Billy Collins's poem Sonnet doesn't have either, but that's an intentional choice on Collins's part as it lends to the lampooning of the form and subject matter. The poem is achieving its goal by breaking the rules. One of my patrons, Lavi Lion, put it really well, and I want to just quote him directly. Quote, "Poetry is such a vast and subjective art form, it's hard to define it because it doesn't have a single meaning. One person's favorite poem might not even count as poetry to someone else. Poetry and ideas on what it is vary from language to language, culture to culture, and even subcultures can vary wildly. It's not a specific enough categorization to have any distinct rules. Certainly, some forms of poetry have fixed rules. Maybe you could objectively critique specific poems based on the criteria of their form, but that actually doesn't tell you whether it is a good poem. I also think that many people who specialize in specific forms tend to bend or break those rules on purpose, to add to the piece in some way. Claims of objective criticisms limit what can be communicated in poetry and how this is done. At worst, this can be a deliberate attempt to censor or control narratives. At best, I think it's foolish to even try to fully define poetry or claim an objective ideal form it takes. First of all, it would alienate artists who don't fit in that box. Criticism is important, community feedback and conversation is important, but the idea of objective criticism in poetry is almost dystopian to me." Unquote. Another one of my patrons, Waifuwu, said that the best way to possibly criticize a poem objectively is to know what the poet's goal was. Then you can measure the poem against their attempted execution. I'm not sure I even entirely agree with that, but I think it's a worthy opinion, and since we can't and don't know what a lot of poets were intending or attempting with their poems, once again, there's no objective way to criticize them. Case in point, basically the entirety of Emily Dickinson's work. But real quick, are you sick of opening your writing software and immediately having to close the AI assistant that pops up? I know I am. What's more, even if your writing software doesn't have an AI assistant, it's likely scraping your writing to train an AI model. If you're absolutely sick of all of this, you should start using a free, privacy-first software, Ellipsis, the sponsor of today's video. Ellipsis is an LGBTQ+ founded company made by writers for writers. You can read through their privacy policy like I did, and you'll find it's completely on the up and up. They will not sell your data, and they will not comb through your writing to train any machine learning or LLM. On top of its pro-privacy and anti-AI policies, the appeal of Ellipsis is the emphasis on collaboration. It's easy to invite people to read and comment on your work. Ellipsis also has a vibrant community with a monthly newsletter, human-made templates for your inspiration, and a Discord server where you can find collaborators. It is so necessary to have a writing/accountability buddy in the 21st century, and Ellipsis's Discord server is a great place to find one. You can use my link, ellipsis.app/rd, or click the link in the description and pinned comment, or this QR code on screen to start using Ellipsis today completely for free. Thanks so much to Ellipsis for sponsoring this video. Now, some of my more dedicated viewers will probably be saying, hang on, didn't you say there was an objective way to critique poetry? And yes, I did. I was wrong. If we want to be generous, we could say that objective was simply the wrong word. And in my defense, I did say some methods were more objective than others, but I don't think that actually detracts from how wrong I was. In my video titled The One Woman Who Ruined Poetry, I listed these 3 things as criteria for evaluating poetry: content, language, and structure. But these 2 are judged subjectively. For some people, certain subject matter will always be interesting in a poem, while for others it won't. Some topics will feel cliché, others won't. When it comes to structure, debates are never ending as to whether certain structures were right for certain poems. In my Bad Poems by Good Poets video, I showcased this piece by Emily Dickinson, and I said I felt the form wasn't quite right for what Dickinson was getting at. Other people, however, disagreed. And as far as language goes, we could take a bar full of people, show them the same poem, ask them to judge the effectiveness of the language on a scale from 1 to 10, and the answers would vary wildly. So while we do judge poetry on the effectiveness and uniqueness of its content, language, and structure, effectiveness and uniqueness mean different things for different people. In that same video, I also included this donkey quote that I love.
The best reviews are entirely subjective, but that doesn't mean you throw objectivity out the window.
What I failed to include was what Donkey says immediately afterwards.
You have to build your case with honest statements that even someone who disagrees with you could relate to.
And remember that, honest statements that anyone could relate to. In my video on Megan Fox's poetry collection, I said that I was trying to review the book objectively. A lot of commenters rightfully pointed out how impossible a task that was, since poetry is so dependent on the subjective experiences of the writer and reader. I think what I was trying to say was that I wanted to separate my feelings about Megan Fox from my feelings about her poetry. I didn't want to pick on her for being her or for her chosen subject matter. I was trying to build a review that anyone would be able to understand and relate to, even if they disagreed with me. The thing is, there's no possible way that any person can remove their biases from any equation. To pretend otherwise would be disingenuous. Rather than trying to measure things objectively, I think better reviews stem from an acknowledgement of one's biases, and an exploration of how those biases were confirmed or challenged by any given work. Before going on, I want to share this quote from Kim Chinky, a quote I shared in my video about what poetry is. In this quote, Chinky is talking about what separates a prose poem from a piece of flash fiction. That distinction could also depend on the observer's eyes, the timing and mood, the light of that one moment. It would be easier if it were about biology, with dominant and recessive genes, each piece mapped out on a chart. But then, what would be the control, the median, the standard deviation? It begins to lean towards science or math, away from those elements that make language so affecting. Anthony Gramuglia mentioned basically this same thing in his video on Mahler. When you try to reduce criticism down to a science, you kind of take away everything that's fun about language arts. However, according to Pinter, there is one arena where objectivity matters, and a search for truth is far more concrete, when engaging with and writing about politics.
Political theatre presents an entirely different set of problems. Sermonizing has to be avoided at all cost. Objectivity is essential. The characters must be allowed to breathe their own air. The author cannot confine or constrict them to satisfy his own taste or disposition or prejudice. He must be prepared to approach them from a variety of angles, from a full and uninhibited range of perspectives. Take them by surprise, perhaps, occasionally, but nevertheless, give them the freedom to go which way they will. This does not always work.
This is quite fascinating because the way Pinter describes objective political characters actually sounds more subjective, allowed to breathe their own air, without confinement or constriction to satisfy an author's disposition or prejudice, approached from a variety of angles and a range of perspectives. And yet these qualities are more true to life. People in the world are rarely one note. That's why Pinter points out that political satire actually takes an opposite approach, where characters, events, and actions are purposefully over the top. But in reality, bad people almost never think that they're bad people. Everyone rationalizes their own actions to themselves, and that's why it's often more interesting to write from the perspective of villains rather than victims. This is something Robert Boswell really hammers home in his book, The Half-Known World. If you'll allow me to pull a few quotes from that book. If you're writing a novel that engages a specific political issue, your obligation is to embody the best argument for both sides of the issue, regardless of your personal stand on the matter. Otherwise, you're lying. Imagine a story where it turns out that the root of all evil is a specific political party. However true this may seem to the writer, it won't make for good fiction. It doesn't permit the reader a place to stand and make her own judgments. One of the common properties of victimization is the stripping away of one's identity. A person being beaten bleeds, and we all bleed in more or less the same way. Without a unique and identifiable human at their center, most narratives fail. The victim almost inevitably becomes a stereotype or simply a stick figure acting out as ordered, which is to say, a victim of the author. A really great example of what Boswell is talking about would be Adam Johnson's short story, George Orwell Was a Friend of Mine, included in Johnson's collection, Fortune Smiles. This story takes place from the perspective of a man who was a prison warden in East Germany during the Cold War, a man who lives in ignorance of all the wrongs he was complicit in. It's an excellent story and an amazing collection. I can't recommend it enough. To illustrate his point further, Pinter points out how political language is typically very unambiguous. It is meant to appear objective to keep people ignorant.
Political language as used by politicians, does not venture into any of this territory, since the majority of politicians, on the evidence available to us, are interested not in truth, but in power, and in the maintenance of that power. To maintain that power, it is essential that people remain in ignorance, that they live in ignorance of the truth, even the truth of their own lives.
This is such a mic drop quote. Is it any wonder that critics who claim to be objective tend to have a right-wing slant? And do these right-wing critics remain in ignorance of the truth of their own lives? I said this in the Critical Drinker video, but I figure one reason the drinker doesn't want to engage with themes is because he doesn't want to engage in any form of self-examination at all. That's why he can say things like this without an ounce of self-awareness.
When your writing process consists of about 90% political pandering, always in one direction of course, and predetermined rules about which identity groups are allowed to do what, and maybe 10% actual creative storytelling, well, you end up with stuff like The Savant.
At this juncture, I'd also like to bring up Ben Shapiro. Shapiro is a Jewish man who's found himself in a precarious situation as anti-Semitism becomes far more mainstream on the American right because of people like Tucker Carlson platforming figures like Nick Fuentes. But while Shapiro doesn't tolerate anti-Semitism, he has tolerated, normalized, and even encouraged bigotry against several other groups, Muslims, trans people, and non-white folks, just to name a few. But as Pinter said, because Shapiro lives in ignorance of the truth of his own life, he never thought the leopards would eat his face. He never imagined that the monster he helped create would destroy him. Regarding politics, art, and objectivity, Pinter points out how many people ignore the political realities right in front of their faces. To illustrate that point, he shares an anecdote about a delegation speaking on behalf of Nicaragua to a U.S. body in the 1980s. The leader of the delegation, one Father Metcalf, told the U.S. body how Contra forces in Nicaragua funded by the U.S. had committed killings and atrocities in schools, health centers, and cultural centers. The leader of the U.S. body, Raymond Seitz, said, "In war, innocent people always suffer."
There was a frozen silence. We stared at him. He did not flinch. Innocent people, indeed, always suffer. Finally, somebody said, but in this case, innocent people, for the victims of a gruesome atrocity subsidized by your government, one among many. If Congress allows the Contras more money, further atrocities of this kind will take place. Is this not the case? Is your government not, therefore, guilty of supporting acts of murder and destruction upon the citizens of a sovereign state? Seitz was imperturbable. I don't agree that the facts as presented support your assertions, he said.
I don't agree that the facts as presented support your assertions. There are a lot of clips I could show to demonstrate how grifters and critics still operate like this, but I'll go with this one.
But you are expecting Ukraine to give up 20% of its territory to someone who invaded it?
Well, is Crimea part of Russia or Ukraine?
Ukraine.
That's where we don't agree.
Well, I'm afraid that's part of international treaty. That's not up for grabs.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, that's hold on. I mean,
it's willful ignorance, or in other words, a lie. Charlie's position in that clip is based on a false premise. Or, to put it a certain way, the facts do not care about his feelings. To bring up Ladyballers again, this actually reminds me of Some More News' videos on that movie and on conservative comedy. Conservative comedy often isn't funny because it's predicated on a false premise. The same is true for Ladyballers. Men, objectively, are not infiltrating women's sports, proven by the fact that the movie was originally supposed to be a documentary and they couldn't make that happen.
Now, to be fair, I think I'd actually suggested to the Crane Boys that they do this as a doc.
Yes.
I originally went to them and I said, you guys should go try out for a bunch of ladies' leagues. And that became not possible because, as it turns out, most ladies' leagues don't allow in actual men. And they weren't willing to go the full distance.
Ladyballers fails in its artistic objective because its very basis is an unfounded foundation. Add that one to the list of oxymorons. I'm sorry to rehash this example as it's really old news by now, but it's a perfect example of how objectivity actually can impact art and art criticism. It's important to realize how many critics start with a conclusion in mind, like the critical drinker. He often forms his opinions based on the trailer and then has to lie about the movie to make his conclusions fit his expectations. For more on that, you can watch pretty much any video from The Birdman, Anthony Gramuglia, or Otterly Noah on The Drinker. To expand on this further, Pinter says,
I put to you that the United States is without doubt the greatest show on the road. Brutal, indifferent, scornful, and ruthless it may be, but it's also very clever. As a salesman, it is out on its own, and its most saleable commodity is self-love. It's a winner. Listen to all American presidents on television say the words, the American people. As in the sentence, I say to the American people, it is time to pray and to defend the rights of the American people. And I ask the American people to trust their president in the action he is about to take on behalf of the American people. It's a scintillating stratagem. Language is actually employed to keep thought at bay. The words American people provide a truly voluptuous cushion of reassurance. You don't need to think. Just lie back on the cushion. The cushion may be suffocating your intelligence and your critical faculties, but it's very comfortable. This does not apply, of course, to the 40 million people living below the poverty line and the 2 million men and women imprisoned in the vast gulag of prisons which extends across the United States.
I really want to home in on the phrase, language is actually employed to keep thought at bay. Much like politicians, objective critics try to use their language to cushion their audiences. As Pinter said, you don't need to think, just lie back on the cushion. It's very comfortable. You might argue that I'm doing the same thing with my videos, but I would argue I'm actually inviting critical thinking and dissent with my videos. Since my Megan Fox video, I have never claimed to be an objective critic. I always end my videos asking my viewers to tell me what they think. People disagree with me, and I love that. One commenter on one of my videos pointed out that I asked for audience opinions like 5 times, and speaking of my videos, the way an objective critic speaks is akin to the phrase, "it's not that deep." It's meant to shut down any discussion or dissent. And funnily enough, a lot of people disagreed with some of my points in my video about It's Not That Deep, particularly the discussion around Sabrina Carpenter's album cover. As many commenters pointed out, the cover makes sense when considering the context of the album. Personally, I still think a lot of people were right to express strong feelings when the album cover first came out, and I think Sabrina's comments on the whole situation have been kind of weird, but I'm grateful that commenters point things out to me, and I'm grateful to have fostered an audience that feels like they can disagree with me. How else am I supposed to learn and become a better writer and critic? Speaking of which,
a writer's life is a highly vulnerable, almost naked activity. We don't have to weep about that. The writer makes his choice and is stuck with it. But it is true to say that you are open to all the winds, some of them icy indeed. You are out on your own, out on a limb. You find no shelter, no protection, unless you lie. In which case, of course, you have constructed your own protection and, it could be argued, become a politician.
the only way you can strive for objectivity as a writer is if you lie. By lying, you shield yourself from the scrutiny of subjectivity. Pinter concludes his lecture by saying,
when we look into a mirror, we think the image that confronts us is accurate. But move a millimeter, and the image changes. We are actually looking at a never-ending range of reflections. But sometimes a writer has to smash the mirror, for it is on the other side of that mirror that the truth stares at us. I believe that despite the enormous odds which exist, unflinching, unswerving, fierce intellectual determination as citizens to define the real truth of our lives and our societies is a crucial obligation which devolves upon us all. It is, in fact, mandatory. If such a determination is not embodied in our political vision, we have no hope of restoring what is so nearly lost to us, the dignity of man.
If I had to interpret this quote, I would say it's akin to Plato's allegory of the cave. In the cave, the prisoners think the shadows are reality. It's not until one is freed that he realizes there is something more real than the shadows. Fiction is like a shadow, or like a reflection in a mirror. Fiction is based on reality. Fiction can show us something about reality and something about ourselves, but the only way to find true objectivity is to go past the shadows, past the reflections. Again, grifters are not interested in the act of defining truth, they are merely interested in arriving at truth, no journey required. They are not interested in looking in the mirror, let alone past it. Is it any wonder that objective critics seem to get so heated about the inclusion of politics in art? As part of his lecture, Pinter reads the second half of Pablo Neruda's poem, I'm Explaining a Few Things. That poem reads, "You are going to ask, and where are the lilacs, and the poppy-petaled metaphysics, and the rain repeatedly spattering its words and drilling them full of apertures and birds? I'll tell you all the news. I lived in a suburb of Madrid, with bells and clocks and trees. From there you could look out over Castile's dry face, a leather ocean. My house was called the House of Flowers, because in every cranny geraniums burst. It was a good-looking house, with its dogs and children. Remember, Raúl? Rafael? Federico, do you remember from under the ground where the light of June drowned flowers in your mouth? Brother, my brother, everything loud with big voices, the salt of merchandises, pile-ups of palpitating bread, the stalls of my suburb of Argüelles with its statue like a drained inkwell in a swirl of hake. Oil flowed into spoons, a deep baying of feet and hands swelled in the streets. Meters, liters, the sharp measure of life, stacked up fish, the texture of roofs with a cold sun in which the weather vane falters, the fine frenzied ivory of potatoes, wave on wave of tomatoes rolling down to the sea. And one morning, all that
was burning. One morning the bonfires leapt out of the earth, devouring human beings. And from then on, fire. Gunpowder from then on, and from then on, blood. Bandits with planes and moors, bandits with finger rings and duchesses, bandits with black friars spattering blessings came through the sky to kill children. And the blood of children ran through the streets, without fuss, like children's blood. Jackals that the jackals would despise, stones that the dry thistle would bite on and spit out, vipers that the vipers would abominate. Face to face with you, I have seen the blood of Spain tower like a tide to drown you in one wave of pride and knives. Traitorous generals, see my dead house. Look at broken Spain. From every house, burning metal flows instead of flowers. From every socket of Spain, Spain emerges, and from every dead child, a rifle with eyes. And from every crime, bullets are born, which will one day find the bullseye of your hearts. And you will ask, why doesn't his poetry speak of dreams and leaves and the great volcanoes of his native land? Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets.
Pinter's Nobel lecture is as relevant today as it was 20 years ago. Neruda's poem is as relevant today as ever. With the realities before us, how could we ever expect to leave politics out of art? But what do you think? What amount of objectivity is possible in critique, if any? Do you agree with Pinter about art, truth, politics, and the intersection of those things? Please tell me everything. And hey, before you go, take a look at this poem. This is a piece by one of my patrons, Malik Jones. Maestro. At times I'm left to wonder if we are merely meant to choose our miseries happiness denied to me, and content a mystery. What god would orchestrate this life with melancholic melody? Frequently I ponder if our sufferings have meaning. Why marvel is a memory? Nostalgia laughs so mockingly, and so merry were the days. Why would God orchestrate this life with melancholic melody? But when my mind discerns this query looks macabre, a line of thinking immature. This is no symphony nor duo. The whole ensemble is just me. For the chance to submit one of your poems at the end of my videos, or if you just like what I do and want to support, you can donate to me on Patreon too. For just $3 a month, you can see videos early, join the community Discord, and hear about the books I'm reading each month. You're seeing my patrons on screen right now, and I truly can't thank them enough. They are the reason I can do this week in and week out. You can also support the channel by liking, commenting, subscribing, chiseling poems into stone, that sort of thing. You can also follow me on my socials if you want, but no matter what, keep reading, keep writing, and ultimately keep in mind, this is a rough draft. And for sticking around till the end of the video, I want to give you a writing prompt. Write a poem or short story about a grifter in the media, news, or political landscape. It can be based on a real person or a fictional grifter in your own mind. Consider these things as you undertake this prompt. Does this grifter know that they're lying, or have they convinced themselves that they're a truth teller? What has their career journey been like? Are they satisfied with their life and their career? Do they like themselves? Do they try to engage in self-reflection, or do they shut down any thought or opportunity to do so? It's your turn, folks. Get to writing.